Every mystery begins with a question, a missing person, a forgotten object, a strange event buried in history. Sometimes the answers are hidden, sometimes they're never found, and sometimes the truth is stranger than anything we could imagine. Welcome to the Unexplained Archives. This is a collection of mysteries, crimes, legends, and unexplained stories from around the world. Tonight's story starts on October 28, 1943, in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. According to one of the most enduring military conspiracy theories ever told, the United States Navy attempted an experiment unlike anything before or since. The objective wasn't to build a faster ship or a more powerful weapon, it was to make an entire warship disappear, not from radar, from sight itself. The story claims the USS Eldridge was surrounded by a powerful electromagnetic field. Witnesses reported a strange green glow. Then, the ship vanished. Some versions say it disappeared only for a few minutes. Others claim it reappeared more than 200 miles away, in Norfolk, Virginia, before returning to Philadelphia almost instantly. But the voyage came at a terrible cost. According to the legend, some sailors emerged violently disoriented. Others reportedly lost their minds. Some were said to have trapped inside the ship itself, their bodies fused with the steel, and a few simply disappeared. If even part of that story were true, it would be one of the greatest technological breakthroughs and one of the greatest military disasters in modern history. There's just one problem. Almost every part of it is disputed. The United States Navy has consistently denied the experiment ever took place. Historians say the evidence doesn't hold up. Scientists argue the physics makes no sense. And yet, more than 80 years later, people are still trying to figure out what really happened. Was the Philadelphia experiment a secret military project that went horribly wrong? A misunderstanding that slowly transformed into legend? Or one of the most influential conspiracy theories ever created? Tonight, we are separating the history from the mythology. The first surprising thing about the Philadelphia experiment is that no one was talking about it in 1943 or in 1944 or even after the war. There were no newspaper reports, no leaked military documents, no eyewitness interviews describing invisible warships. For more than a decade, this story simply didn't exist. The legend only begins to appear in the mid 1950s, and it begins with one man. His name was Carl Meredith Allen. Sometimes he called himself Carlo Miguel Allen. Allen was an eccentric merchant seaman with a reputation for telling elaborate stories. Over the years, he would write long, rambling letters filled with strange claims, philosophical digressions, and conspiracy theories. Separating fact from fiction in his writing was never easy. In 1955, Allen contacted astronomer and author Morris K. Jessup. Jessup had recently published a book called The Case for the UFO, exploring the possibility of extraterrestrial visitors through the lens of science rather than sensationalism. Allen believed Jessup was asking the wrong questions. Instead of looking to the stars, he should be looking at the United States Navy. Allen filled the margins of Jessup's book with handwritten notes, thousands of them. Some challenged Jessup's ideas, others hinted at secret government research, but one story stood out above all others. According to Allen, he had personally witnessed an extraordinary experiment while serving aboard the merchant ship SS Andrew Purcell. He claimed he watched a nearby naval destroyer become surrounded by a strange green haze, then disappear completely. Moments later, he said, it reappeared hundreds of miles away before returning almost instantly. He insisted the experiment had catastrophic consequences for the crew. Some supposedly suffered severe psychological trauma. Others were said to have vanished without explanation. The story was unlike anything Jessup had ever encountered. Most authors would have dismissed it immediately. Jessup didn't. Not because he believed every word, but because Allen seemed convinced that what he had witnessed was real. Curious, Jessup began corresponding with him. The letters became increasingly strange. Allen expanded the story, adding new details about advanced physics, secret wartime research, and technologies supposedly inspired by Einstein's unfinished work on unified field theory. Then something unexpected happened. In 1957, the Office of Naval Research received an anonymous package. Inside was a copy of Jessup's book. Every page was covered with handwritten annotations. Many appeared to be written by Allen. Some suggested there were multiple anonymous commentators discussing alien civilizations, advanced technology, and the Philadelphia experiment as though it were established fact. The Office of Naval Research found the document unusual enough to reproduce a limited number of copies for internal circulation. That decision would change everything. Until then, Carl Allen's claims were little more than private correspondence. Now they carried the appearance of official interest, and for many people, that was enough to transform an unbelievable story into a possible secret. Before asking whether the Philadelphia experiment happened, we need to ask a simpler question. Could it have happened? The ship at the center of the story, the USS Eldridge, was real. It was a Cannon class destroyer escort commissioned by the United States Navy in August 1943 during the height of the Second World War. It served in the Atlantic, escorting envoys and protecting them from German submarines. Its service record is well documented. The mystery isn't whether the Eldridge existed, it's whether it was ever involved in anything resembling the experiment Carl Allen described. One reason the story felt believable was that US military really was conducting extraordinary scientific research during the war. Radar technology was advancing rapidly. Sonar was transforming naval warfare. The Manhattan Project was secretly building the first atomic bomb. Entire scientific programs operated behind layers of classification. To the public, many wartime technologies would have seemed almost magical. The specific technology most often linked to the Philadelphia experiment was something called degaussing. Unlike invisibility, degaussing was completely real. Steel ships naturally generate magnetic fields. Those fields could trigger magnetic mines hidden beneath the ocean. To reduce that risk, engineers wrapped electrical cables around a ship's hull and passed current through them, creating a magnetic field that cancelled out much of the ship's own magnetism. The goal wasn't to hide the ship from people or from radar, it was simply to make it harder for magnetic mines to detect. Photographs from the period even showed the cables running around naval vessels, giving them an unusual appearance. To someone unfamiliar with the technology, it might have looked like an experimental machine. Over the years, many historians have suggested this is where the legend began. A genuine military technology, misunderstood, then gradually transformed into something far more extraordinary. But supporters of the Philadelphia experiment argue that degaussing was only part of the story. They point instead to Albert Einstein. During the 1920s and 30s, Einstein researched for what he called a unified field theory, a mathematical framework that would unite gravity and electromagnetism into a single set of equations. He never completed it. There is no evidence he ever discovered a method for bending space, rendering objects invisible, or teleporting matter. Yet, conspiracy theories often claim otherwise. According to the legend, the Navy secretly obtained Einstein's unpublished research and used it to generate an enormous electromagnetic field around the Eldridge. That field supposedly bent light around the ship, making it invisible. Then somehow it distorted space itself. Modern physics offers no mechanism by which this could occur. Generating magnetic fields does not make solid objects disappear, nor does it transport a 1,200-ton warship hundreds of kilometers in an instant. The amount of energy required would be beyond anything humanity has ever produced. Which leaves us with an important question. If the science doesn't support the story, why do so many people still believe something unusual happened? Because that's where the evidence becomes much more complicated. So, what evidence is there that the Philadelphia experiment actually happened? The answer depends almost entirely on what you consider evidence. Let's start with the strongest claim. Carl Allen insisted he witnessed the experiment himself from the merchant ship SS Andrew Furset. If true, that would be extraordinary. There's just one problem. Historical shipping records suggest the Andrew Furset was nowhere near Philadelphia on the date Allen claimed to have witnessed the experiment. Supporters argue the records could have been altered. Skeptics point out that changing military records is one thing, changing civilian shipping records, harbor logs, and the memories of dozens of unrelated crew members would have required a conspiracy on an entirely different scale. Then there's the USS Eldridge itself. The ship's official deck logs place it elsewhere during the period the experiment was supposedly conducted. Again, believers argue that classified operations wouldn't appear in ordinary records. That's true. Governments have hidden military projects before, but historians point out that removing one secret experiment from the record is very different from rewriting an entire ship's operational history. The burden of evidence becomes much higher. Then there is the crew. Over the years, several former crew members publicly denied that anything unusual had happened aboard the Eldridge. Most described the Philadelphia experiment as pure fiction. Some expressed frustration that they were continually asked about an event they insisted never occurred. Believers often focus on something else. Not everyone spoke. Some former sailors declined interviews entirely. To conspiracy theorists, silence became evidence. But silence is difficult to interpret. A veteran might refuse interviews for any number of reasons: privacy, fatigue, trauma unrelated to the legend, or simply because they were tired of repeating the same denial. Silence can support almost any theory, which makes it poor evidence for any of them. Perhaps the most significant development came in 1996. The Office of Naval Research released a public statement addressing the Philadelphia experiment directly. According to the Navy, no such experiment had ever taken place. The statement explained that many of the story's details appeared to be misunderstandings of genuine wartime technologies, particularly degaussing. For historians, that explanation is persuasive. It accounts for the real cables wrapped around naval vessels. It explains why unusual electrical equipment may have been visible aboard ships, and it requires far fewer assumptions than teleportation or invisibility. Even so, not everyone was convinced, because one question remained unanswered. If Carl Allen invented the story, why? He never became wealthy. He never published a best selling book. He never turned himself into a celebrity. In fact, those who knew him described him as intelligent, deeply eccentric, and often difficult to separate from his own stories. Some researchers believe he genuinely believed what he was saying. Others think he enjoyed creating elaborate mysteries. Either way, one man's extraordinary claims became the foundation for one of the most famous military conspiracy theories ever told. And perhaps that's the strangest piece of evidence of all. Not that the story survived, but that it survived despite so little to support it. By almost every historical standard, the Philadelphia experiment didn't happen. There are no verified government documents describing it, no credible eyewitness accounts that withstand scrutiny, no physical evidence that a warship was ever rendered invisible or transported hundreds of kilometers in an instant. The simplest explanation remains the strongest one: a real warship, a real wartime technology, an imaginative storyteller, and decades of retelling. So, why does this story refuse to disappear? Part of the answer lies in the world that created it. The Second World War was an age of genuine secrets. The Manhattan Project employed more than 100,000 people in complete secrecy. Radar transformed warfare before most civilians even knew it existed. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park quietly changed the course of the war, their work hidden for decades. History has shown us that governments are capable of astonishing things and remarkably good at keeping them hidden. Once you know that, stories like the Philadelphia experiment become just believable enough to survive. Then came the Cold War. Public trust in governments began to erode. Stories about secret weapons, hidden laboratories, and classified research found eager audiences. The Philadelphia experiment became woven into a much larger mythology. It was linked to UFOs, time travel, the Montauk Project, even the Bermuda Triangle. With every retelling, the story grew a little stranger, and the original claims became harder to separate from everything added later. Perhaps that's why the Philadelphia experiment has endured for more than 80 years. Not because the evidence became stronger, but because the story became larger than the evidence. It taps into something deeply human: the feeling that somewhere behind locked doors, someone knows more than we do. that history contains hidden chapters, that extraordinary discoveries are waiting just beyond public view. Most of the time, those stories turn out to be exactly that, stories. But every so often, history reminds us that yesterday's conspiracy can become tomorrow's declassified document. That tension is what keeps legends like this alive. Not certainty, not proof, but possibility. The Philadelphia experiment almost certainly wasn't a secret breakthrough in teleportation, yet it remains something else entirely. A fascinating example of how myths are born, how rumors grow, and how sometimes the stories we tell about history become more powerful than history itself. And that's why the trail goes cold. Whatever the explanation may be, the questions remain. And as long as they do, the story continues. This channel is going to be home to a lot of stories like this one, unsolved, unexplained, but always rooted in real people. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious.